say an official hello. So we are now recording. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. These really are two absolutely outstanding poets. I've been working with Omar for 15 years.
No more,
And
16.
wow, and Edward for not, getting on for that as well. So, and it's just lovely to see the development of these poets and how such excellent voices can keep pushing their boundaries. So you are in for an absolute treat with both of these collections. If you haven't bought copies yet and you would like to do so, which you're bound to want to do so after hearing, if you put that code in for sign 24 in capitals on Cinnamon Press, that will give you 20% off everything in your basket. So take a look around, see what other poetry is about, what other novels you might like to read, but most of all, support these two poets today. It really, really is important for small press poets to find audiences, and it's a constant uphill thing to get that done, and to get these voices heard, and they are voices that absolutely should be heard. So, buy them as gifts. Who knows how many days there are to Christmas, but it can't be that long. Blink and it'll be here. So you can stock up now, tell other people about them, let people know. The recording will also be on the website, so people can come and listen to that and hear the poetry for themselves as well. But do support these fantastic poets. I'm going to introduce Omar first, and he's going to read for a while, and then I'll introduce Edward, and he will read for a while, and then we'll have chance for question and answers. You can put those into the chat, or you can put them into the Q&A. Either is fine. I'll pick those up and field them so that people can be not answering and reading at the same time. So it is lovely to have your questions. And if you'd like to speak your question, just put your hand up and I can make that happen so that you can actually be heard. We used the webinar feature because when we started doing Zooms, it was quite a fun thing for some people to do Zoom bombing and come and spoil launches, and they can't get into the webinar platform quite as easily as they can get into meeting platforms. But we are kind of thinking of reviewing that in the autumn because it is also quite nice to see your audience. So it's kind of it's had pluses, but maybe it's time for a change. So we will be reviewing that. But if you do want to speak your question, just let me know by putting your hand up. So it's absolutely fantastic to be welcoming Omar back again. It doesn't seem that long since the last collection, which was absolutely wonderful. So do have a look at Omar's other books that are on the website too. Omar is an absolute powerhouse of work. There's stuff going out all the time. He's writing poetry constantly at a really high level. He writes in literary and academic journals. He's got a really amazing list of publications in fiction, in creative non-fiction, in commentary, and in poetry. And we've been lucky to publish, I think, all but one of the poetry collections, and they're absolutely beautiful every time. So I'll leave you to read the biography, and you can also see that on the website. But you're in the hands of somebody who really knows his way around words.
Thank you so
For
much.
Echo,
Thank you so
for
much,
Echo,
John. Oh,
you're
sorry.
welcome. For Echo delves really into the depths of human emotions. It's really opens up relationships, but always with Omar's work, the power of language itself, the art of language itself is always really foregrounded. And in each new collection, we get taken further. And For Echo is definitely no exception. Writing in the preface, Omar talks about his best poems, the most real, are those which he writes not as myself, but as the person who I'd like to be. And I think that kind of sense of the aspirational and how these poems move you forward and just connect with humanity is really, really important. And I think that's the hallmark of great art, this ability to both be self-reflective and hold up that mirror, but also be honest and then to reflect outwards. These are poems that are poignant and intelligent and really transformative. We're reaching with Omar to the person we'd all like to be. And we're also getting to know a person we really know there's a real creature at the heart of this collection. It allows us to see through an exceptional mind's eye, which is something Fiona Sampson said about the collection, and very rightly. So I'll stop talking for a while and over to Omar.
Thank you so much, Jan and Adam and Edward, just for this opportunity as ever. Really looking forward to it, and it's going to be immense fun, I hope. So I was thinking I would read 8 to 10 poems. They're not all very long. I'll see what I can get through. But I did want to say one thing about the nature of the book. It's split apart from the preface and afterward, which are kind of reflective essays about my psychology as a writer and what goes on in me as a writer. It's got 4 sections. The first section is For Echo, eponymously. These are poems which are self-reflexive to do with the art of writing itself in different ways. The second section is called Collecting Beauty. These are poems, as ever with me, responsive to love relationships, whether they be parents or children or siblings or what have you. The third section is called Bites of Inwit, a Joycean phrase to do with, I suppose, conscience or negatively toned poems. And the final section, Losing North, are more philosophical, directly philosophical. So I'm going to read a few from each one. I'm going to start with a poem in the first section called A Family Tradition. And it's dedicated to my mother. I wrote it in Spain a few years ago. And it's about how there's a paradox in being a literary person, a reader, an avid reader, whether one goes to books because of the way one's rigged, or whether going to books rigs one a certain way. So I'll read it to start off with. When we talk about reading, it's a family tradition. My mother, snug and pillowed on her side of the bed, would read histories and novels, traveling far from her cushioned spot, warmed by knowledge. And when she passed her love of books on to me, I chose my way, a paradox between leaf and tree. And as the boughs shook, damp and black, the air welcomed each odd raindrop, unshackled and free. And it was like the whole garden of the language in which I read began to dream. And the precision and the acute lodging of the words, page by page, began to stir the wheels of thought. But I could never tell if the quick, charmed mind came first, or if the serried placing of the pacing words worked to slake a thirst that was never there, not until the water came in bursts. The first one I want to read from the first section. The second one I want to read from this opening section is a sonnet. I've had a colleague of mine who I gave a book to really liked it. It's typical of some of the sonnets in this collection. The sonnet form is something that comes naturally to me. It just fits the way I think. And it's kind of more reflectively driven than image driven, but it's a sonnet called An Intellectual. I presume to call myself one. Whether I am or not is a different matter, but I tend to presume to call myself one. And this is a quick sonnet. He doesn't greet the morning like a clean slate, a blank check, or a raised tablet. The tidbits of day for him are peopled by ghosts, echoes in gray mirrors, and devils in shadows. And in his grand and stately efforts to see all things from behind or from below, he must give up a living world, shackle the free hands that others possess, use, their yes, their no. And having grown married to thought so long, so well, to doubt himself proves a habit that endures, that is quick and immediate, a rigging of mast and sail on a sunburnt sea. Others will have to learn to praise the telltale if, which is his strength, knowing so as not to know. And the last one I want to read from this section is called A Wish. And it's for my daughter, like many of these poems. They're for my daughter, my sisters, my wife, my parents, and so on. And this, again, is written, I hope, in a relatively plain spoken manner, but expresses the feeling, which is authentic and genuine. So let me read it. A wish. for Alia Sabbagh. She wants to be an artist, she says, and I can guess at the undisturbed way and the force and the singular radiance of her direction. With sterling show, she's straight and sure to achieve so much more than this coin of love may land to offer her. And she will live to build things like doors and doors, in a door like idiom the more. And I couldn't wish a better wish to be bold, a green ticket in the sunlight. And I couldn't stretch my heart and wish for eyes more lit than hers, swimming in their illuminations. So I will let her paint her mystic way, as I have painted mine. And her colors will dote, I think, upon a canvas. And the canvas will turn with love, insist she draw with craft the mythos of her primal name through each wild-eyed stroke. Tamed by years I may never know, a father so far before the future, and time as time will go. From the second section, I wanted to read, these are all poems dedicated to family members or loved ones. This one I'm quite pleased with because I think it's also very true to life. It's called Pebble Gem. There's an echo here of digging from Seamus Heaney, I think, not with the language, but in the kind of theme. It's about my father. And yeah, I'll read it. It's split into two parts. One is more descriptive, one is more reflective or philosophizing about the descriptive part. Pebble Gem. At 18, he was a zealous leader, my dad, and those early days led him through the slopes and curves of the next 2 decades. Imagine a silken mountain, the pearl white snow. And then, entering the truer flesh of age, he did the things a man might mostly do to lift and light the way, to pave the idling ease for his growing family. He made good money, and our lives were lived as though upon a starlit stage. But the glamour of our drama, the glittery show, was so much deeper than any mere mummer's way. But then the ache and strain beneath the fabric began its deathly pull, and the skein of what was rich turned on a pivot, went unknitted, stitch by golden stitch. Perhaps each one of us needs to live 2 lives within our given time. Perhaps the dearly avid love we spend, we gain, solely then to spend it all and all over again. And if there's any waking guilt beneath those treaded boards, any tax or toll or fee that's due, it'll be my line, I fear, my script, my cue. But then I cannot act like him. I am a gray and roughshod pebble beside his better gem. This one is for my daughter. There's a few literary references in the book to writers like Proust or Kafka or Joyce or what have you. And this one is called Rereading Proust, and it's for my daughter as well. It's a bit longer, but I'll read it. And Jan, do tell me when I'm beginning to run out of time. I think we've still got plenty, right? Okay. Rereading Proust for Alia. To lie back and subtly enter your prose. The red scraped and red scratched color of my living room sofa becomes a throne, laced with warm vermilion, the lava of love at home, honing what's far away and over there and making it homely and making it here. And I can imagine once again why it is that certain close and coddled spirits find their coolness, their shade, the slow worm of their idling inside the slow soft serpents of your prose. The rigors of the beams of sunlight, the cursing heat of later worsted days, redressed by the sempiternal glaze that washes the windows of the passing years, and offers time, time that flutes all with fear, a time to find itself, named and timed and speared by the words we have for fascination. And you'll be glad to hear my daughter in the war zone of the heart. Each night we bid her say goodbye to the struck and striking light of the daytime of her moving mama's mind's boisterous ways, and the way that her sharp awareness shines through each small thing she chooses to drape the clamor and din of her littler sunlit time here with. and you'll be glad to know her father was just the same. If not so, still. The last one from this third section I wrote again for Alia, many poems for my daughter. It's a sonnet which I wrote in Cairo last summer, quite quickly. Again, it's I suppose straightforward, but still I hope charged with emotion. The middle breath. I want her to be able to wish her shadow well, and to bite her tongue before the jagged wall this bone-sad life can prove at times. To be brave, even when the scansion's off, dimmed by something gone wholly wrong, unmusical and rhythmless, and the kilter of her living moving to the feel of a troop of carrion birds circling in a grimly gray-toned sky. Heralds of the clouds stood tough there, like tar-black sets ahead of her and above. And I wanted to read as well the world around her with a stiller eye, and to listen to its colors, to its waking style, and to place herself before death like an enemy, a queen above all of the middle breath. Then I'm going to read one from Agambites of Inuit. This is about Gaza. It's titled When Wonder Sours, and it's written after Gaza, or the beginning of the troubles and the catastrophe and the horrors of what's happening in Gaza. When wonder sours. The angels had given it its erstwhile dignity, and each day, as it was sluiced away into a rabid bestiary, each man who'd known it once, like a hope and a faraway gift, made somehow strangely close to home, saw wonder sour, and at the cup's rim his lips felt poisoned, felt lit and flamed by time, the culprit working its tale of venom. But the story runs touched and deeper than that. For even when the aged philosophers who met to discuss it now, to address its late coming fate, spoke of rinsing their feet in the whitest rivers again, the world, it was seen, was bereft of water by then, and nothing that might course and flow had proved the norm by then. And an ache and a slow and secret zero became for a world its metonym. Thank you. And then I'm going to read just two or three from the last section. Do I have time? Good. The first one in the last section is called The Wisdom of Margaret Yourcenar. Her novel, Memoirs of Hadrian, is actually, I think, one of the most perfect books I've ever read, along with other books by Ford, perhaps, or A Passage to India. I just think it's a perfect book. There wasn't a line that didn't work and didn't work for the novel. So this is called the Wisdom of Margaret Yourcenar. I close the book, sentenced to repose. I have traveled a second time, entering the voice of a mortal man who makes the woman of his prose immortal, breathing sense through opened lungs of the ultimate almost, wise as air marshaled by a cool breeze, clever with such polished quiets that I feel the meaning weight of all of life weighing in the eyes that scan the page. I'll sleep better tonight than most nights, and rest will sliver through my mind like a death with nothing left behind. A circle closing in upon itself, so pure and so refined, the voice of a man cannot reach it with all the words, shaped between joy and rage, a man may try with. Sleep like this is sage. This pen breaks me at the wrist. My fingers tremble as they now dissolve, desist. Can I read two more? Have I got time? Right, the next one I want to read, I wrote a friend of mine, a literary friend, great writer, translator, novelist, poet. She's from the Ukraine, Svetlana Lavochkina. This poem was written dawn light in solidarity with Ukraine when the Ukraine-Russia thing started up a few years ago. And it's in a much freer form, I suppose, in terms of line length and flow. And I'm going to read it now. Dawn light. A softly glazing sun lifts the morning into life, and there are no flags billowing in sight. buffeting the eye, offering the breeze their taxing colors, their thick-set fee. At this rude hour, a certain nakedness lifts the world I live in. There are no countries at war here, no dead bodies bank the sides of the river of being. A certain step marks the walking of the world at this hour, sure, simple, at ease. And the composite floor that makes the world a weapon seems smoothened here, adamant to be made crystal, pure, like one lone line of memory, but one lone line shorn of any detail, sparring like nervy beaks in recollection. And it's as though this lack of parts, of cogs chugging against each other, made the motor of our lives one whole movement, seamless as a mother, with no time to rend bit from bit, or now from then. The early morning hour where a few daft shadows play, as is the early morning way, seems to unmake the weird geography of the very litanies of grey that batten themselves to things beneath the glaze of early morning. No nation sets here, let us say, and none seems lit, dawning. The last one I'm going to read is for Alia again, philosophical. It's called Gradations. It's about teaching my daughter to deal with negative capability, I suppose, what kids call negative capability, or the idea that life or the experience that we experience isn't always categorically placeable, that you have to deal with life and not accept that you won't be able to comprehend it all the time. So it's called Gradations. More philosophical, as I say. I hope it works. So, how to explain to a child the fertile wilderness of indecision? How does one finger well at the coyness of the truth? How style the wisdom to be found in a world of different dancing, sparring levels of to the light, a fanfare of degrees where no scissors may seem to be of use, and how words like blunted spears go hurled at no enemy but at oneself? How can I arm her not to covet, not to lunge with logic at the living stuff you cannot lunge at? There is no forgiveness in the real. It has no need and no heart for it, no protocol by which it might be named or judged. Only time doing its rash, its slipshod business in ways that outshine the seriousness of the mind. I want to tell her of the joy I've found in seeing the infinite gradations made to chastise the questioner, cage the hand that would grip, the wonder and the blur that makes things just what they are, meaning so much, but being so little. That's me done. I hope that was in time. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much, Omar. Absolutely fantastic. Such a range and an intensity across those poems. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. And we're already beginning to get questions in the Q&A, so that's lovely. And do put more there if you'd like to, or more comments as well. Okay, so it's an absolute pleasure to be introducing Edward. And again, I think Omar and Edward's last collections came out at roughly the same time as well. They've been in step on 2 or 3 occasions. So it's lovely to kind of bring these very different but very rich and really, really voices that are pushing themselves, that are pushing their boundaries, that really know about language together. Edward, it was born in Stockton-on-Tees, so just a stone's throw across the river from where I was born. Really, really good part of the world. He's lived in Beijing since 2007 and first came to us as joint winner of one of our poetry awards, and we've worked together ever since, which has been absolutely fantastic. Like Omar, he's also got an academic background. He's also published critical pieces like the Wallace Stevens and the Aesthetics of Abstraction. And he also has this other fantastic and again, really amazing, not just interest, but, professional to a very, very high level. He founded Dragon Phoenix Wine Consulting and became a master of wine in 2019. And if you think of the numbers of people there are on the planet, there are 417 of these people across the world. And it's been really interesting. Often Edward will send an email about the next course he's doing and the next course, and the amount of work that's gone into that. And I think that's very similar to the amount of work that goes into the poetry. When Edward decides to do something, he's going to do it to a really high degree and really, really well, and really put pressure on it. And that really shows in this beautiful collection. Vital Signs is a book that includes mourning and devotion. There's poetry here about the passing of Edward's father. It's delicate, it's got precise rhythms, it's got the sense of the body. Edward's poetry is always fantastically sensual in every aspect of that word, and you really feel the embodiment of these poems. It takes inspiration from the medical vital signs, and it uses body, pulse, and breath for its three parts, but it does so with such subtlety. And in each of sections, there's 9 poems, and they explore a whole range of human emotion and embodied encounters, from romantic love to death to grief to loss. Always this pulsing of life goes through it. There's a real alchemy here that enables us to get inside these poems and to really feel the humanity here and savor what really matters. Please welcome Edward Ragg.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan, and thank you again to Jan and Adam and Omar for making today possible, and to everyone who's joined from all around the world, which is really, really wonderful to see. I'm going to do something slightly different from previous launches and just see if I can share my screen. And what I want to show, just going to check everyone can see this, if you just bear with me. As Jan mentioned, this is the cover of Vital Signs. You'll see that it has a distinctive symbol on the front, which some of you may recognize. It's a Triskelion symbol that in Greek means sort of 3 legs. It signifies many different things. You'll find it on the flag of Sicily, the Isle of Man. It's a Celtic symbol that has thousands of years of history, which represents the stages of life and other kinds of harmony. It also happens to be the symbol of Brittany, where Adam and Craig run Cinnamon Press. So it was a particularly fitting one to be in itself a vital sign. And so, as Jan mentioned, the book is divided into 3 sections: body, pulse, and breath. And I'll read poems from each of those. Each section has 9 poems. The book is indeed dedicated to my father, who passed away in 2021. The book juxtaposes, I suppose, poems that relate to romantic love, different stages of life, grief, and other experiences. I want you to remember, though, these kind of colors, this looks blacker in the PPT. The book is actually a dark gray with this rather distinctive orange. And please remember that, because it's going to be important for one of the poems in the book. So the first poem I'd like to read is called First Breath, and it's from, not surprisingly, the breath section of the book. It is a love poem. It doesn't really require any more introduction than that. So this is called First Breath. Before our lips touch, we inhale this first breath. Our diaphragms lift, our abdomens contract. Then each and every molecule of vapor exhaled embraces the moist evening air. Our lungs conduct this dance of gaseous exchange. And the heart, only the heart knows what lips will touch. The lips, its emissaries. Or maybe only the tongue sends back words silently to the heart of how it feels to beat outside the body. Then the heart may know love is the consistent beat that shares the pulse of another body echoing. The next poem I'd like to read is actually the second in the book. It's in the body section. It's called A Second Body. And as you can see, it's prefaced by a very famous text. This is the Aeneid, Book 6, where, of course, Aeneas, like Odysseus before him, has gone down into a land of the dead, in his case to meet the soul of his father, whereas Odysseus meets his mother. And one of the things we see in Virgil's slightly more complex underworld is the river Lethe, where some souls are drinking the waters of that river to lose memory, but have a chance at a second life. So this turns out to be a poem really about middle age, a second chance at life, and what that encompasses. And I'll just read the English translation of what Anchises says to his son Aeneas. My father is only mentioned in this poem, but is not seen in the underworld at this point. So I'll just read the preface. Then Father Anchises said, "They are spirits destined to live a second life in the body. They congregate here to drink from the brimming Lethe, and its water heals their anxieties and destroys all remnants of memory." So this is called a second body. I had not thought to return alive, as the world burnt to ember and cinder, the coldest winter in living memory. On the palate, a bittersweet aftertaste of Lethe's least potent shallows. That flavor gone, a subtle mouthfeel remains, like silken leaves. What system outage at Hades' ink allowed this exception to stroll almost unnoticed through the gates of fate? A second body, but the same. Young again, if facing the mirror of middle age. Memories of the first life, days lost, and that fateful pain in the chest. Also, what should never have been remembered. The ferryman's face wrinkled with anger as another, undead, but unbidden, ignoble too, dared muddy his waters. The banks of souls, my father nowhere to be seen, and indelible even to Lethe's drops, the frantic recoiling of those still weeping at the feel of warm sand between their toes. A second body, still wet from the latest escape, out from the poet's wilderness of stars and woods, and whatever glorious unseen fields those were. How we laughed to feel it, leaping, lithe, unclean. Those who are familiar with Wallace Stevens may hear a few echoes of Large Red Man Reading and a few other poems, but it's not essential to know about those. So the next poem I'd like to read is called Unfinished Symphony. And this is why I wanted you to remember the particular colors of this slate gray and sort of amber, because the next poem, it's actually in the pulse section of the book, is about my cat Pudgy, who is a miniature British shorthair, who was rescued from a cattery during the pandemic here in China, where the animals were simply going to be put down. And I had this strange experience really of welcoming into our home a real pedigree cat, which I'd never had before. There's a reference to wine here. Some of my poems are concerned with wine, but this is a small reference that needs a little explanation. A kind of wine produced from the Riesling grape called TBA, which is a very sweet amber botrytis-affected wine, which resembles her eyes. And I think that's all I need to say for introduction. So this is called Unfinished Symphony, and it's about a cat purring. This slate grey miniature British shorthair, with eyes as amber as Riesling TBA, purrs with the pulsing crackle of firewood, echoing in the flickering hearth of her chimney organ nose. The humming pulse of contentment only a cat can sing. I wonder too at her beating heart, inaudible beneath this tireless orchestration. Silent conductor at whose battens flick she sets the varying tempo. Considering how her exuberant chortles on life recall Mongolian or Tuvan throat singers, vibrating their vocal cords to pitch not one tone, but two. Such chords of wonder, such double-pitched harmonies as can make one voice another, like this cat's insatiable duet of clarion and diapason. How she revels in grateful frequencies, the high flame of excitement soaring above the burning embers of remembered pleasure, pulsing like double basses below. There is no real language for her tones. The French ronronnet is not mes amis on par, a par on real purrs. The Chinese ma jiao says only the cat calls or cries in the hutongs of her dark nights. But purring is not calling. Who can even name her genius of embodied noises, yes you, pedigree purrer, performing each day, with no coda it seems, her unique, unfinished symphony of peace. And the next poem I'd like to read relates to a particular experience I had just before my father passed away. In fact, the very night before he passed away. And I'd managed to get from China to my parents' home in England. And in this sort of late summer night, a bat came into the house. And my mother was quite, distracted by this. And so I had to get it out of the house. It's not an uncommon occurrence, perhaps. But by getting the front door open and sealing off all the other doors, I'd hoped that this bat had left. And I went upstairs actually to check. And by my parents' old bedroom, there was a chair, and I found the bat there, sort of panting, really. So this you might think a poem about bats would be in the sort of pulse section in this book, but it's actually in the breath section. And then eventually she was able to escape. And there's one thing I should mention, which the poem refers to a concept in Puritan culture, a form of reading called typology. The Puritans basically saw in nature, be it animals or anything, a tree or a rose, obviously evidence of God's existence and creation, and also perhaps the second coming. And they called those symbols, became what the Puritans called types of heaven. And my father passed away the next morning, so I couldn't help, in a sense, but want to read something into the appearance of this bat. So this is called The Bat in the Chair. How had she entered the old house? A young navigator, testing her bearings in the echo sense of a warm September night. Reluctant intruder, sweeping through the back door or sashed window left ajar to twilit fields. I secured the internal doors as she flickered in frantic arced flight on extended calcas. Then, momentary disbelief she'd been reunited with dark-winged night. But on the landing I found her, each third digit folded over her exhausted wings, panting for breath on the chair by your vacant room. So tiny in her resting state, her black fox head, nose leaf, and svelte ears slowing to the inaudible tune of a recovery. I tumbled downstairs to unlatch the old oak door priests once heaved, glad she'd already swooped past, unheard and unseen. Next morning, you stopped breathing. I recalled the young bat who'd visited your old lair, yearning for significance, doubting as it flew inaudibly past how any Puritan in the heart could breathe a word of how she was a type of heaven. And yet, somehow to this day, I know the little bat who lost her way that night was harbinger of all last journeys and resting spots. What remains, what is beyond remaining, the rest is silence. How only the night can hear the end of being, echoing. And the rest is silence is, of course, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, the last words Hamlet says, and rest is the remainder of things, but also an eternal rest. So I'd like to move on to another poem. It's from the body section of the book. I hope I'm okay for time, Jan. So thank you. It's called Body of Evidence, and the poem that sort of stands behind this is a very famous love poem by John Donne, Valediction Forbidding Mourning, which famously has unusual images or conceits, as they were called, such as the pair of stiff twin compasses that reflect the two lovers who, no matter how far they are apart, their souls are connected. So there's a sort of background poem to this, but this is called Body of Evidence, and it's about a long-term relationship and how relationships change over time. Body of Evidence. For over 20 years, we've roamed the earth, its valleys, deltas, skies, the great body of it, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes alighting on tarmac in distant lands, from Huasco to Cafachate to the Sicilian tides, without touch, but with each return journey in heart or mind. Love is not a map, unless its scale is 1-to-1, like Borges's cartographic fun. And true it is, from love's valleys, deltas, skies, how hard to see the outer limits or view from above of the same hearts beating in parallel. As perhaps two souls find they are not stiff twin compasses, whose arms are always joined, no matter where they roam. My heart traveled too, trying to find the better man who'd always lived inside. Can I say in love we locate ourselves? Perhaps you are right. No matter what the day or anniversary tiding, we are still ourselves in our own way, traversing years without need of demarcations or direction signs. We are not the Doros, boundary stones, nor countersign proof of the once betrothed. So we end where we began, stepping out into the world's heart once more, the body of evidence amassing like swelling tides caressed by the moon. The one-to-one of journeys ended and journeys begun. The next poem is slightly longer, and it's called Heart of Hearts, the Pendulum's Beating. It has two very different contexts that are referred to. One is Galileo's theorizing about what became the pendulum clock. And this was based on an experience he had as still a teenager, going to mass and seeing a great chandelier that had been lit by the priests swinging from side to side. And it seemed to him that even though that swing was getting gradually shorter and slowing down, it was still seeming to have the same pace. And this gave him the idea for pendulum clocks, which then were invented by a Dutch humanist a little bit later. But it also refers, it's a love poem, in fact, about hearts being synchronized. And it also refers to the COVID lockdowns we had in China, which in 2022, when this poem was written, were so profound. You would get up out of bed in the morning, and you wouldn't know if you could leave your apartment or do anything. And we lived like that for a long time. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it affected, of course, people's relationships. So this is called Heart of Hearts, the Pendulum's Beating. There is the feeling of the heart beating. There is the feeling of the rhythm of our hearts beating. And there is the feeling of feeling. These three we feel. Devices count time by the oscillation of chords, their crystalline precision. But there are no two clocks that can be synchronized as your heart and mine. In 1583, let's say it was Sunday, the 10th of March, Galileo attended Mass in the cathedral in Pisa, watching the great chandelier swing gently to and fro as a priest lit the first candles, then let it go. No matter the weather or the incensed words from the pulpit that day, as the chandelier gently shortened its swing, the time it took to mark its beats was always the same. But how could he know? The teenager counted his pulse, watching the chandelier always shift in seemingly changing pace to the same time and space. So you and I incline to each other with the regularity of two pendulum clocks. Across this city, across mountains and sea, without speaking, your heart speaks to me inaudibly, because our heart of hearts always beats the same. Today, I saw a discarded hazmat suit, abandoned in a basement car park, crumpled white-grey boot covers trampled into the seat of its pants, and thought, this is still our world. No matter the barricades, the wire fences, the smartphone code suddenly denying us, the closing, the sealing of every door of every locked-down compound of this perpetual now, our hearts vibrate to the perfect calibration of a love which says that this is still our world. I'm going to finish this first section and say one poem for the end, as Jan mentioned. And this is a slightly more magical poem, perhaps, called Marco Polo and the Snowflake. When I did 3 weeks of quarantine in obviously one hotel room in Beijing in 2021, I noticed, because you'd be visited by medical staff, obviously, daily, but there was a spy hole in the door, and it had debossed on it the words Marco Polo. And this made me think very much about the sort of fantastic tales of Marco Polo. And there's another sort of, not source poem, but poem behind this, which is Coleridge's Kubla Khan, which obviously is a dream vision, and in his case, unfinished. So those are two of the poems surrounding this one. So this is called Marco Polo and the Snowflake. In the quarantine hotel, I lift the lids of the unpolished brass spy hole embedded in my bedroom door. Yellow light looks in. Only on dropping finger and thumb do I see this camera obscura's shutter is debossed Marco Polo, as if his ghost beamed on the floor. Outside, Beijing snows. The ginkgos sway, one green, one yellow, one considering orange days. Later, the wind will rise as packed snow confronts the greenest ginkgo, calling yellow and orange witnesses to its annual demise. But what is 1 year in the life of a tree? I look through the glass like a Venetian in Murano whose life is elsewhere. The glass blower's breath enlarging the snow globe of some forbidden city, as magical as Polo's tales of Kubla Khan. His heart floating midway on the waves between buried city and pleasure dome. The latch on the window is loose, but the chain strong. I can hear planes skidding off ice at Daxing, and your breath condensing across the city, where in that crystalline garden you catch snowflakes quietly in your hand. Perhaps I am incapable of seeing Venice, or can glimpse only a gondola stuck in ice or citadel frozen in glass beneath the waters. We pray for glacial weather, so you may cross the frigid laguna and take my hand. But though in love, this is not our city. Here, our blinking phones illuminate the passageways between us as a billion shutters open and close. Can I say my chained window is ajar, the room held on ice for your arrival? Do we care who is looking in or why? And if I open the lid again, will we see Polo's love untying her silk brocade outside? All impossible as Venice in a Beijing light. They will never believe you came this way, shaking their heads in the thawing night. They will never believe you alighted in my hand, fresh from a snowflake, born on the breath of this November wind. Some say I told this tale to Marco centuries ago, and oft he repeated it in the hostile passageways of that amorous city. Some say. I say your breath is the wind that buoys me, that incredulity melts quickest at the heart's open core. It was no dream, no miracle they saw as they spied through the keyhole or bolted the convex lens from the door. A stranger seating a snowflake in the bow of an icy gondola that flew away. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen if I know how to do that. Stop share. Okay. So thank you. That's me for now.
Wow.
Jan, we can't hear you
I hear
because your
you,
your mic's on.
That helps. Thank you very much, Edward. I was just saying that the phrases in that last poem just go on resonating. Thank you so much, both of you. Just such wonderful readings. And I know that's what we're getting in the chat. There's some really lovely comments there in the chat. And we also have some questions. So Christian Schull says, Omar, your work is beautiful, vivid. Could you comment on what is your writing process? And that's probably a really great place to start for both of you. Omar, do you want to kick off? What's
Well,
your
yeah,
writing process?
I will say this. I tend to write most days on impulse. And sometimes I'm in the right, I don't know what, I mean, I can't look into my mind and find out what the chemistry is doing, but sometimes I'm in the right frame of mind to produce something fresh and really working as a piece of writing. And sometimes I'm just forcing it. But my process is actually, I would say, fast, very fast. Within an hour, I finish a poem. And I very rarely agonize over poems. I don't. My psychological nature is not to kind of spend a month going back and forth tweaking a poem. Some poets who do that, and they should do that, and they benefit from it. But I tend to write very quickly on impulse, and keep the ones that somehow work, and throw away the rest. So, you know, I don't like to say this, but I like to write every day because it gives me gratification and self validation, and you know, in a way it's easier to write poetry that you can throw away or keep rather than work on a novel for 10 years and then realize it's crap and throw it away. So I'm a kind of impulsive writer, really, and I kind of I clutch onto that process because it prevents me from being too vulnerable in a way. So, and there are loads of reasons for that. But if you just want to know descriptively, the process is I sit down, I'm fresh in the head, and I just write. And whether it works or not, it depends, on what's happening.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so quite high attrition rate, but also just that complete sense of flow, which is, yeah. Edward, what about you? What's your process?
I'm very different from Omar in terms of process, and I think this is to do with temperament. So, you know, I'm aware of how often Omar's writing because he sends poems out to his email group, and I'm sort of astonished by the frequency of that. But as he's explained, that's part of that is his process. I think for me, I would find it difficult to write every day, not because I don't enjoy the process, but for me, I suppose things build up either in my life or experience, and then find their way onto a page. And I am someone who revises a lot. I think probably Omar could relate to this as well. There are occasionally experiences you have in writing a poem where things just come together, in which a first draft is almost a finished poem, and you might have, you know, little revisions you want to change, and that's often very exciting. Sometimes those can be some of our best poems, but equally, I think some of my longer poems, like say Marco Polo and the Snowflake, that went through multiple revisions. One of my favorite poets is George Oppen, and Oppen used to revise very, very frequently, and said he had an inexhaustible ear. And I think that's something has influenced me to some degree, in the sense that I'm willing to go back and go back and go back and keep on revising. And so you never quite know, because obviously once we write these poems and hopefully they're published and other people read them, it's for other people to decide what they think has worked in terms of a finished poem. So I wouldn't say to me that the poems that are worked on to a greater degree come out as being a bit too polished or a bit too worked. And equally that the ones that came out rapidly are the more successful. That wouldn't be true. So I think process is to do with temperament, as Omar's explained. His temperament suits his production, if you like. For me, if someone said to me, "You give up your work in wine and sit down and be a writer," I think I'd be just staring at a blank page, because I'm not. I need to have maybe quite a diverse life, shall we say, in order to build up the material to write to some extent. I'm not living a life for material, obviously, for poetry, but that's my process. I'm not writing every day, and something builds up in me and then finds its expression in a poem that might be revised repeatedly, depending on the poem.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and really interesting about temperament and how people do have such various processes, which I always find process endlessly fascinating. But I think also, particularly for new writers, they often want to ask about process in the sense of, you know, I could nail it if I just do this. And actually, you can't, because you have to find that process, as you say, Edward, that actually resonates with who you are. And I think that's really, really important. I'm going to go to Andrew's question next and then come back to another one, because this one kind of follows on. Andrew says, huge congratulations, Edward and Omar, on the new collections. You're both prolific and experienced poets. How has your poetry writing process, the really specific routines and methods by which you create the poetry, changed and evolved over the years? Has it stayed a fairly continual thing, or have you changed that process around over years of writing? Edward, do you want to start us off on that one?
Okay, yeah. So I suppose so. You were just talking, Jan, about people who are new to the craft and are just beginning to try to write poems. I began writing poems as a teenager, and I was lucky as a teenager, to have some contact with the British poet Peter Redding, who was friends with one of my teachers at school. And as a 16-year-old, and this is to help answer Andrew's question, I shared some poems with him, and we met in person, and we went over the process in which I was writing. And he said something what I thought was quite important at the time, and still I think is. He says, don't really write down anything until the poem is more formed in your mind. And maybe that was his way of working. And so initially I began not to really work on poems on a page. My process when I was, say, trying to write poems as a teenager and when I was in my early 20s at university, say, was to be vocalizing, to be creating poems that would then be transcribed to the page when they were closer to completion. I suppose that seemed to work at the time. I think I've changed to an extent, a large extent since then, because I've gradually learned that that there is a poetry of the page, and obviously Peter Redding understood that very well. But I've come to work, and I think sometimes it depends on form. So Omar was talking about sonnets. There's a poem in my first book of Force that takes called Reversing Sonnets, where the first line of the first poem is the last line of the second poem. The second line of the first poem is the penultimate. So it was like writing a mirror image sonnet. And that was something I could never have done purely vocalizing or sub-vocalizing the words. It had to be a poem that had to be constructed on the page. And there's a part of me that feels there needs to be that wonderful marriage between sound and vision on the page. So I've come to work a lot more on the page in that way. And the other thing is there was a big change for me, although I don't know how much of a difference it makes overall, was I think when you're beginning writing and trying to build up a body of poetry, which ideally you might then send out to magazines and try and get published, you're sort of working from poem to poem, as it were. And so my first book of Force That Takes was really a collection of the best poems I'd amassed by that time, sort of joined together by a quite general theme, like a force that takes, whatever that might be. Whereas in the more recent books, I've been writing them as books, and maybe you could say that was influenced by Peter Redding. I don't know, but there are plenty of poets who have, sometimes in a postmodernist way or in other kinds of relatively self-conscious ways, have created specific books of poetry that are not a miscellany kind of put together. And that was particularly true for And Then the Rain Came, my fourth book, and then of course this one, Vital Signs. So I think my relationship with the process in that sense and the finished work has been to deliberately create volumes of poetry, not just poems. And then of course we get that joy as poets working with Cinnamon Press to then look at pagination and see which poems. I really love that way, and Omar will be very familiar with this as well, of how poems seem to be mutually reinforcing once they sit on opposite pages or in sections, as we were describing. So that has changed for me radically.
Brilliant, thank you. How about you, Omar? Do you feel the process has shifted over the years of writing?
Well, I too, to a certain extent, start in my head. Normally, for a poem to work for me, I have to have the first 1.5 lines or 2.5 lines as I want them to be in my head. Once they're on paper, that kind of leads me, that kind of created, it's like taken away from infinity, delimited my options now. And I tend to finish the poem within half an hour once I've got those first few lines that I feel are working in my head. But no, in terms of, I know what Edward's talking about. I tend to not work as much towards fully formed books, but just poem to poem, and then later cull and kind of group poems in certain thematic, where they're cognate thematically. But no, I think since I was young, I mean, not young, I started trying to write poetry, like, with ambition to be published around 2006. And I think we can all, I mean, John can attest to this. I've been impulsive ever since, and I'm 42 now. So maybe I don't have the excuse to be as needy for, recognition. But no, my process, as you say, Edward, it's a temperamental thing. It's actually a psychological thing. And that's what a temperament is to a certain extent. I am very impulsive. Whereas with my prose, I feel like I'm more ambitious in a way, or more idiosyncratic in a way. Whereas poetry for me is like the most immediate way to use language. I mean, for me, poetry is less about the content than about the ability to deploy words. And that's true, I suppose, of all my writing to a certain extent. Language comes first, and then any thematic concerns. And so therefore, that means that as long as I'm able to use language, it doesn't really matter what story I have in my head. I'm happy enough. So yeah, so I don't think I've changed that much. I mean, I've matured a bit. So I'll write a poem in half an hour and I won't necessarily accept it. I'll go away for half an hour, come back. But I still, to this day, and I've never done this, and I think maybe I should, write poems that I do come back to a week or 3 weeks or 4 weeks later. I don't do it because I'm just that way, but there's an argument to say that my poetry might change or improve even if I had the patience. But as I say, temperamentally, I'm I'm my own worst enemy at times, and also can be an aid to myself if I'm feeling productive and fresh. So No, I haven't really changed. Unfortunately, I'm still a child. If I put it honestly.
Thank you, Omar. There's a fantastic question from Marta. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Um, Edward, as a bilingual, she's very interested in untranslatable concepts, and you gestured towards that in relation to the way the Chinese describe the cat sounds and how different that is. What's your relationship with the Chinese language? Do you write in it at all? And do you see Chinese meanings or ideas coming into the way you use language?
Well, thank you much. As an old friend of mine from Cambridge days, who is indeed at least bilingual. And I wanted to just acknowledge Andrew, who asked that question, because we were at school together, and he will remember me trying to write poetry as a teenager. So it's lovely to have these kind of questions. So my relationship with Chinese is slightly odd in a way, because it's very much influenced by my professional work. When I moved to China, I was 30 years old and couldn't speak any Chinese apart from a quick thank you, 谢谢. But I have a reasonably musical ear, so I was able to hear differences in this kind of tonal language. I didn't really formally learn Chinese, so I don't read that much. I can text a bit in the language, but I've learned Chinese specifically to give classes and presentations on wine. So, if the conversation's about malolactic conversion or carbonic maceration, I can do that, but I can't, read Chinese poetry, or, I can introduce wines from around the world and this kind of thing and how they taste. But I have to read, say, Chinese poetry in translation. And so maybe one day I'll have more of a closer relationship with the language, but my day-to-day Chinese is not fluent. And I have very specific vocabulary, shall we say, and a bit of the grammar to fit that together. But to try and answer a bit more of that question, really, do you see Chinese meanings or ideas coming out in your own use of language? I think one of the things that made a big difference for me in living in a different country where I couldn't speak the main language, obviously, was that I was also teaching in a Chinese university, Tsinghua, which has some of the most brightest students in the country, but teaching in English. So this had an effect on my English poetry, because I was no longer relying on speaking or communicating in English idioms. So I had to sort of, in a sense, not even though the English level amongst my students was quite high, and became higher the longer I was teaching at that university, which I did for 10 years. I could never assume that what I was saying would be absolutely understood. Actually, in any language context, you can't be sure of that, right? But so this actually, I think the effect it had on me is that because I was not living in England, and in a sense felt not distanced from the English language. That wouldn't be true, because as Omar was saying at the start about reading and the practice of reading, I was always reading things in English. But one consequence it had is I would check my own knowledge of the English language. So, for example, whenever I'm using a particular word in my poetry that I might be slightly unsure as to a range of meanings for, I will go and check it. And so I love to use dictionaries. So I don't have a close relationship with the Chinese language, in short. Whether I occasionally end up thinking like a Chinese poet, I don't know. But I have had contact with Chinese poets, and of course I have a good friend, Wang Ao, who is a poet who's translated some of my poems into Mandarin. So I think that I find it quite interesting when other people can read those poems in another language, and of course they become new poems, but that's a different point. So sadly, Marcia, I don't have a revealing relationship with the Chinese language, except to say it has made me think more about how I actually use English, and that's had a consequence for my poetry, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mark has said, for both of you, to what extent, if at all, does mental visual imagery play in the minds of and how does that help form the language and words, if it does? And so, the kind of what's the influence on process of mental and visual imagery? Omar,
Right.
do you want to?
I would say that I'm more of a philosopher. I'm not really a philosopher, an academic philosopher, but I philosophize through poetry more than I do describe sensual experiences. Sometimes I do both, but my first instinct is to think through a problem with a poem. That's why a lot of people I know, especially in the Middle East, where I think, as far as I know, the tradition is much more purple and centered around images. They expect your poetry to be extremely image conscious, whereas I tend to write more discursively. Sometimes that can be a weakness, but sometimes you get it right, you're doing something that's natural to yourself. But I was thinking about this the other day. I was at a conference recently, an academic conference, and they were talking about the difference between the modernists, make it new, the pounds make it new, and the Georgians, who are more sonorous and perhaps less precise with their language. I wrote a poem recently where I put the phrase, I'm talking about the people dying in Gaza, die and pass away. Now, if you're being strict, that's like a redundancy, right? I mean, you're using the same meaning twice. And I've often had poets tell me, why have you used the phrase money or lucre? They mean the same thing. But I tend to write more like, as a poet at least, less like a modernist, less stringent, and more like a sonorous kind of poet who will do things perhaps with language that are not absolutely, in terms of reference, needed, but they're part of the music of the emotion and the feeling added on to a reflection. So in short, I would say that I'm driven more by thoughts or like themes that I want to flesh out in a clever way, as opposed to something more sensual. Yeah, that's kind of how I come across. That's how my vision kind of starts off with, at least.
So
That's
the discursive, and
it sounds
I'm
just
also
because it sounds
hearing
wrong.
something about sound, the
Yeah, it is
sound of
sound.
um
I
rather
often think,
than
we're
visual.
talking about a relationship to language. What I like to think is that, thought and word, there's a nexus in your mind somewhere that's kind of doing the business. And that's kind of where I think I might be, at times effective. That kind of nexus, the way in which words are lodged in your mind. And I often think it's because I read a lot, and I still read a lot, but not as much as I used to because I have a kid now. But I used to read, hours and hours upon a day for decades. And I often think that one's facility with the language, in English in this case, is down to reading so much that you see the same word in different contexts, like in different pages and so on. And that ends up lodging itself in your mind in a certain way so that you can use words in that kind of fertile or consolatory way from the experience of spending so much time reading, I suppose. And that's what I think. I'm guessing that anyway. I don't know if it's true.
Brilliant, thank you. Edward, how about you? I'd guess it's quite different.
So yeah, and I was just thinking it's interesting what Omar was talking about in terms of the I want to address Mark's question about mental visual imagery, because it made me think about, in this case, my book's called Vital Signs, and we saw from the cover, there's a very specific visual image that's a symbol that is sort of directing people's attention to what would be a vital sign in certain cultures, and then reversing from that and saying, well, the language of the book is attempting to be vital signs as well. I don't know in my own case if my poems are particularly influenced by visual imagery, be that mental or be it photography or film, although there are things that influence me in all arts. I'm going to talk not about a mental visual image, but a very distinct symbol. So there is a poem in the book called Angel of the North, which is about Anthony Gormley's extraordinary structure. And that every time I passed that, and every time I sort of read about it or seen images of it, that I knew I wanted to, in the body section of this book, write a poem about Angel of the North that would connect me with that particular part of my life and growing up and for part of my childhood in that part of the country. So I think in some of my poems, and then that takes on a mental quality just simply because you've absorbed that live statue, as it were, but it's not live, but an object that is in nature. And Gormley says something quite interesting about museums are basically hospitals for objects that can't look after themselves. Sorry to anyone who's involved in museums or curating, obviously they have more power than Gormley is implying, but in his work, he's very much wanted to put sculptures out into nature or public spaces. And so I'm digressing a little, I know, but In this particular case, there was a very photographed visual object that I wanted to write a poem about, but that was quite a specific case. I think if we talk more generally about poets and imagery, be it influenced by current technology or older technologies, there was, of course, a movement in early modernism to write poems in very stark, short forms and images poems that then translated into objectivism. So I mentioned George Oppen. If you look at his first book, Discrete Series, which was published in, I think, just as the Great Depression was starting. I'm embarrassed I've forgotten this, but that book has very, very strong objects and images, sometimes statues, things that clearly prompt the poem. And you're meant to focus on those. I think if I look at Omar's writing and mine, I wouldn't say the poems are prompted by strong mental visual imagery. That's not to say they won't engage with visual images, or in some cases very raw things, as in the poems that Omar's been writing about Gaza, say. But that it's not something that directly inspires me in writing. So I think that makes sense. I hope it makes sense.
Really interesting to come to Jean's question after that, because she's asking, is inspiration channeled through vision or memory? You might want to just continue with that, Edward.
I don't think it's hard to say, really, isn't it? I mean, is inspiration channeled through? I mean, and what is inspiration as well? There's a literal, to be inspired by something doesn't necessarily result in the creation of a poem. I think we think about, we use the language of a poet has been inspired to write X, say, and there's obviously a truth in that, where something has prompted the inspiration of a poem. I'm not sure how to answer that, really, because I don't have a feeling in my own writing of inspiration that comes through either what we see or what we remember. I think for certain poets, memory is, of course, hugely important. If you look at Wordsworth, the number of poems that involve recollection and spots of time, obviously, in the prelude, there are some, and Omar was talking about Proust, of course, whose work is entirely about memory, certainly in Search of Lost Time. So I think for some writers, memory and recollection, be it from their own experience or having received ideas of the experiences of others, can become very important. Or it could be you end up writing a poem that's very much in the present moment that doesn't rely on a particular memory. But so that you could say that could come through vision or any of the other senses. But Gina said vision rather than just seeing or the visual. And so vision, that word has connotations of religious inspiration, if you like, of different ways of ending up creating something, whether, so for Christian poets, that could easily be inspired through some form of spiritual experience. So I don't think it's a choice of vision or memory. I think it depends on, again, temperament of poets, what inspires them. And for me, I couldn't say either way which of those it would be.
For me, I think it's memory sometimes, vision, yes, in the sense of some guiding direction, in terms of some guiding feeling or guiding thought. But I was going to say that for me, it's more about words on the page. You know, once I see a line or two down, I'm ready to finish the poem. I'm not saying I'm directed by language, but I would say that a vital part of my working up poems is not inspiration in the sense of something that's preceding writing. It's more like even a physiological urge to express myself, which then goes down onto paper with a few lines. And suddenly now I'm in a place to kind of start chiseling away and making a poem meaningful. I will say this, though, when I'm writing about causes, because I'm a very confessional poet, at times quite lyrical. But when I'm writing about causes like Gaza, or like I have a book that was published a year ago called Cedar, Scenes from Lebanese Life, where I was narrating stories about modern and contemporary Lebanon. When I've got my content, as it were, ready for me, and I'm focused on that content, it can actually facilitate I wouldn't say better poems, but more readily available poems that work, because you've already got that delimitation of what you want to write about. And I tend to write quite boldly, which I don't know, that's temperamental as well. You know, I want to feel like the music and the effect of the poem is affecting someone on the other side. And often, as in my preface to For Echo, tonality. I like to think of these poems as being, in some sense, irrelevant to what they're talking about. I want to hear the voice across the lines go. You know, the lilt and the rhythm of the voice is one of my biggest kind of drives to write. That's why I can sometimes write with redundancies, but at the level of music they work. And so tonality and the way the kind of speech sounds in my personal ear and then on the reader's side is pivotal to me more than perhaps memory. I was going to say one thing though. You know, Lowell was studying with Ford Madox Ford in the 30s in America when Ford was in America, and Lowell asked Ford, what's the most important thing a writer should have? And Ford answered, memory. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how true that is, but I think it's true to, as Edward said, to a lot of people. And that's not necessarily about autobiographical memory, but about one of the key features of creating, meaningful structures is perhaps memory. It doesn't have to be a particular memory. It might be some sort of something more structural about it. I don't know, but I think memory and imagination and how they melt and how they kind of dynamically intertwine, I suppose.
Thank you. And Christiane said, Omar, do you have an audience for whom you read for feedback or an editor? And she loves your process.
Do I have an audience? I have no, not really, actually. I write most days, and within a month I'll know which ones were really good poems. You can delude yourself as a writer, especially with my process. You can lose perspective. You can think what you've written is great, but in truth it's not. That's the weakness of my process. That often I can think poems which I thought were good actually aren't that good. But no, I don't have any. Apart from Jan, when I'm putting together a book, Jan will intervene at times and normally absolutely rightly. But overall, no, I don't tend to have someone or a group of people who get back to me about my poems. Sometimes people like the poems and they send me a nice note, but no, I don't really have a ready structure there to kind of give me feedback. So I'm all on my own.
Brilliant. Fantastic. And Christiane's also asked about whether you would have any advice for somebody who wanted to write in the kind of process that you use.
For me,
For both of you, but you go, yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think the way I write is I don't want to say unique because I'm sure it's not, but it's just part of who I am. Being able to deploy language gives me a kick and actually keeps me, Edward, keeps my vital signs going, really. I have to write. If I couldn't write, I'd be very miserable, I think. So I do think that it is a part of my vital signs. Whether it's good work or bad work, it doesn't matter. Just the opportunity and the wish to write keep me. It's a vocation for me. It's not really a profession, and I wouldn't recommend my process to anyone to whom it didn't come naturally, because my process can be weakening in part, but it just depends on how you're rigged, how you write, how you go between drafts and so on. It's as Edward said, we all have very different mindsets and temperaments. So yeah, there's no real answer to that. I wouldn't advise anyone though to artificially try and write too quickly. No, I wouldn't do that.
Part of it is just turning up and doing the writing.
Yes, you have to be there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
to do with the word of inspiration. I don't think there is inspiration, but also, you can't wait around for a thunderbolt to hit you. You have to be in the medium itself to find the good stuff, to a certain extent at least.
How about you, Edward? How would you advise somebody wanting to write?
Yeah, well, just to add to that point, so Omar just said you can't wait for a thunderbolt to hit you in terms of inspiration. So I think when you look at the history of poetry, it's littered with poets writing about the difficulties of writing, or the fact they can't say anything, or everything's been said before, particularly when you get to a certain point of poetic history and belatedness. So you can't, as Omar was implying, you can't randomly sort of select a process for yourself just because it works for another poet. Having said that, I think there is a general truth that in order to begin writing poetry at all, you have to have read a certain amount of poetry, and it's often advised to try and imitate, not necessarily parody, but imitate poets who mean something to you. And those poets will, in a sense, come to you if you read widely. I mean, for we were talking about Seamus Heaney earlier. The poets that have, I pick them up and read them, and I find myself wanting to write. So rather than the daily experience that Omar was describing, I'm sure he's probably had this experience too, with find out the poets that you like to read for whatever reason. There are occasionally poets I read who don't inspire me to write, I just happen to admire. But when I think about the poets who have really mattered to me over the years, be that Seamus Heaney or possibly Tony Harrison, or of course Wallace Stevens, George Oppen, Jack Gilbert, and many others, Elizabeth Bishop, these are poets who make me want to write, and obviously make up part of a pantheon of the people who've helped me think about poetry. And so I think imitating writers that you enjoy reading, that because there is, as you start out writing poetry, there is a sense of satisfaction in having crafted something that, whilst it may not yet be your individual voice, it at least has the structure of a poem, or at least is inspired in a positive way. And so it's what Heaney talks about, the distinction between craft and technique. And craft is something you learn in this process, perhaps, of imitating other poets. But you don't want to end up just being a soundboard for another established voice. So hopefully you then find your own way of writing through that process. That's what I would advise.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's really wonderful. Edward, would you like to read us a final poem?
I will do, and I hope the screen, thank you, the screen sharing thing has worked. I know it's a slightly different experience. I'm just going to bring up again my PPT. The last, I hope, can everyone see that? This is the last poem here. I just want to check it can be seen. Okay. So this is called Circular Breathing, and it's about my late father, and actually scattering his ashes on the vegetable garden in my parents' home, which is a very appropriate place for his sort of final resting place. Why is this poem called Circular Breathing? Years ago, I learned how to play the trumpet, which I don't play anymore, apart from obviously blowing my own trumpet. And one thing I learned from being a fan of Wynton Marsalis was when he was 19 years old and already a very established musician, he would do these very long trumpet solos, which relied on what's called circular breathing. And it's a technique where you're able to breathe out and breathe in at the same time. And don't get me to explain how that works. But the last 16 lines of this poem, effectively, they're one sentence. And what it means is that it's quite hard to read all of that and find the time to breathe. So there's a little bit of circular breathing involved in the reading of this poem. I should just say that over the fence from where my parents had a vegetable garden, there is a cemetery in a tiny village in County Durham called Byers Green, and there are some graves from those who passed away in the Great War, but their remains were never found necessarily. So this is called circular breathing. We took deep breaths and advanced on the garden, holding each other as we went. I stowed the makeshift urn between bicep and clavicle, surprised at its weight, pausing for breath as the wind wetted our eyes, already liquid in the bright afternoon light of Durham skies. Autumn leaves skipped across the verdant lawn as we reached the vegetable patch, grassed over when it had become too much for you, or just too much, recalling gluts of courgette and once proud artichokes surveying the cemetery over the fence. Father, we will not commit you to hallowed ground, knowing you consecrated this plot with love, leaks, and the chemical sense of every element. For a moment, I smile at how the deep green of this unintended lawn is nitrogen-rich. Here, where compost and manure married macro and micronutrients beneath our feet and sustained our bodies too. The wind gets up. Oh, no. I open, sorry. Is that still displaying? Okay, thank you. I open the urn, conscious the world's breath will one day scatter us, as I sieve through the air your final bonds, phosphates, sulfates, calcium salts, forming a circle, no, you correct, an oblate sphere. And I am breathing more heavily now, though the load is lighter, as if the wind drew the oxygen out our lungs, as this final ablation replaces the last breaths of words and what we thought to say in remembrance, as I remember suddenly your incredulous look, as I failed to explain Winter Marsalis's circular breathing, returning my childhood trumpet to its case and recalling all those remembrance Sundays playing last post in the assorted villages of a chocolate box England which never breathed light of day anywhere but in the hearts of those dead soldiers epitaphed over the fence, but their bodies in Flanders, wishing I could inhale now the molecules we are exhaling and re-oxygenate each and every heart that is grieving, as in the circle of your ashes I pledge to live, as if each moment were punctuated with our last breaths.
Wow.
That's where I'll stop for now.
That's an extraordinary, fantastic poem to end with. Thank you. Thank you so much, Edward. And I'm going to ask Omar to share a last poem. And before I do, I just wanted to show you the cover of a little pamphlet that we did probably about a month ago. And normally our books take easily 9 months, usually a year, and we're really quite strict about that process and about taking a lot of time. But the things that were happening in Gaza, and the coincidence of that with a personal loss in Omar's life, just made this such an urgent pamphlet to get out. And we did it in a long weekend with pretty much no sleep, I think, from any of us. And it is moving and exquisite and very important. So when you're popping for echo and vital signs into your basket, please make sure you take one of these along with you as well. So if you'd like to read us a last poem, Omar, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan. And thanks again for being so phenomenally quick in getting this out there, which is really good. The book is half for my uncle and half for Gaza. I'm going to read one poem about Gaza based on one of the visuals I saw a few months ago, where this child who was a toddler had lost his limbs and he was being held up by his father, who'd also lost one limb. And the child was beaming at his father. He was smiling gleefully, and it just moved me. So I wrote this poem. It's called "This Child of Utter Song." I see him on the news, a now limbless boy. He smiles at his father, lifting him high. And though this father has lost a leg, it's only one leg, and the boy, smiling gleefully, lifted into the shiny morning sky, is happy, it seems, because what the night before denied, life and more, feels like a smaller stranger now, night by night, reneged. There is nothing in this world the boy delights in more than being lifted into the light of his father's eyes. These two survivors. He'll never walk again, of course, and his father will be a lifelong prayer to crutches. But at least life remains, and the vibrant stitches that seam a child's young life hem him in with care, say just as glamorous to this child as they ever were. I cannot imagine it, though my eyes do see the picture on the screen. What it would be like to be happy with no limbs and a crippled father. I can only stagger in my mind, let it wander roads and paths and pains I'll never know. Who is he, this brave, bold boy, smiling? Who is he, this child of utter song, this child of sheer perfect music, blow after blow after blow.
Thank you so much. And it is a collection that everybody should be reading. Absolutely beautiful. And also the juxtaposition with the personal loss in it is absolutely exquisite. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. That has been, I think, the best lot of questions and discussion that we've had, bar none, on we've been doing these Zooms now since, you know, COVID, so since 2020, and we've had some fantastic discussions, and the questions this afternoon have been absolutely brilliant, and a real sense of engagement and a real sense of digging deep into this absolutely fantastic poetry. So do go along and let people know. The video of this, if you want to let people know about it, will be up within the next couple of days on the Cinnamon Press website, on the blog. And in the meantime, you can use this code ForSign24. It needs to be in capitals, and that will get you 20% off everything in your basket. Thank you all so much for spending time with us, for your brilliant questions, and for the quality of engagement and the brilliant all the responses in the chat have been absolutely wonderful. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day, however much. I think some of us, it will be a little bit of evening, and some of us have a bit longer to go. So thank you all very much.
And Edward and Adam, thank you so much.
No, thank you to everyone who's joined today and for a wonderful experience. And it's lovely to hear Omar's work again. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Goodbye, everybody.